You are now listening to Revenge of the Invisible Billionaire, authored by Triple G. Chapter 1. The rain hammered against the cracked windshield of Daniel Reed's 20-year-old Honda as he pulled up to the towering glass fortress of Blackwood Industries. 3 years ago he'd been dragged out of this very building by security guards, his wife Catherine watching with cold detachment as her father, Maxwell Blackwood, publicly labeled him a parasite and a failure. Today Daniel was worth $12 billion. Not that anyone would know it. He adjusted the frayed collar of his deliberately shabby jacket and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. The designer's stubble and unkempt hair completed the image of a man still struggling to make ends meet. Perfect. Mr. Reed. The receptionist's voice dripped with disdain as he approached the marble desk. Mr. Blackwood wasn't expecting you. I have an appointment, Daniel replied, sliding over the printed email confirmation. Regarding the Robertson acquisition. The receptionist's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. There must be some mistake. The Robertson deal is strictly confidential and handled exclusively by our senior partners. I have information they need. It wasn't a lie. Daniel now secretly owned Robertson Technologies through a labyrinth of shell companies. The Blackwoods were about to overpay by hundreds of millions for what they thought was a straightforward acquisition. 20 minutes later, Daniel sat in the familiar boardroom where he'd once proposed innovations that could have saved the Blackwoods from their current financial troubles. Ideas they'd ridiculed and dismissed before throwing him out. The door swung open. Maxwell Blackwood entered first, his imposing frame somehow diminished from Daniel's memory. Behind him walked Catherine, still breathtaking in her cold perfection, and her brother Richard, who'd once spilled wine on Daniel's only good suit at a company gala and laughed it off as improving the fabric. None of them recognized him immediately. 3 years, a different hairstyle and 15 pounds of muscle had changed him. Catherine saw him first. Her glass of water froze halfway to her lips. Daniel. Maxwell's voice boomed with irritation rather than surprise. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Daniel smiled, revealing nothing. I'm here about Robertson Technologies. Richard snorted. Are you delivering their mail now? Or did they hire you to clean their offices? Daniel slid a folder across the polished table. I'm here because your acquisition strategy is fundamentally flawed. Robertson's semiconductor division has been operating at a loss for 6 quarters, masked by creative accounting. Their valuation is inflated by at least 30%. Maxwell snatched the folder, flipping through the detailed analysis Daniel had prepared. His face darkened as he read. This is proprietary information, Maxwell growled. How did you get this? More importantly, Daniel replied, is what you plan to do with it. Robertson is bleeding cash, but their R&D division has developed a quantum processing architecture that could revolutionize the industry. That's where the value lies, not in their current product line. Catherine studied him with newfound curiosity. And you know this, how exactly? I work for a consulting firm now, Daniel lied smoothly. We've been tracking the semiconductor industry. I thought my former family might appreciate the insight. Richard's laugh was sharp and dismissive. A consulting firm? Let me guess. You're the janitor who overheard some executives talking. Richard, Catherine warned, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. Maxwell slammed the folder shut. Whatever game you're playing, Daniel, I'm not interested. Security will show you out. Daniel stood, straightening his deliberately wrinkled tie. The offer to help still stands. I know more about Robertson than anyone in this room. Ignore me at your own financial peril. As security approached, Daniel locked eyes with Catherine. For a fleeting moment, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, that the man she'd abandoned was not the same one standing before her now. Goodbye, Mr. Reed, Maxwell said. Don't contact us again. Daniel smiled as the guards escorted him out. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. In the lobby his phone buzzed. It was Lin Wei, his COO at Reed Global Ventures. Are we proceeding with the Robertson acquisition? She asked. Yes, Daniel replied, stepping into the rain. And prepare the paperwork for Atlas shipping. The Blackwoods will make their move there next week. They don't know what's coming, do they? Lin's voice contained a note of admiration mixed with concern. No, Daniel said, watching Catherine through the glass walls as she argued with her father. They still think I'm nothing. He ended the call and climbed into his old Honda, driving past his fleet of Lamborghinis and Bentleys parked in his reserved garage across town. The game had just begun. Chapter 2. The charity gala at the Pressman Hotel represented everything Daniel had once been denied. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic reflections across the ballroom as Manhattan's elites circulated like exotic fish in a billion-dollar aquarium. Daniel adjusted the cufflinks on his moderately priced suit, expensive enough to get him through the door but deliberately understated. He was attending as James Chen's +1, a supposed business associate of the tech magnate who was actually Daniel's closest friend and earliest investor. "Remember," James muttered as they navigated through clusters of wealthy socialites, "you're Daniel Reed, struggling financial analyst, not Daniel Reed, the mysterious owner of Phantom Enterprises." Daniel smiled. "I remember who I am." Across the room, the Blackwood family held court. Maxwell's booming laugh punctuated the ambient chatter as he worked potential investors. Richard flirted with the wife of a Saudi prince, oblivious to the dangerous game he was playing. And Catherine stood slightly apart, a champagne flute dangling from manicured fingers, looking oddly disconnected from the opulence surrounding her. "Target at 2 o'clock, James whispered, looking as frigid as ever. "She wasn't always that way," Daniel said automatically, then regretted the momentary weakness. "Your ex-wife your problem," James replied. "I'm going to mingle. The Thompson sisters just arrived and they're looking for new investment opportunities." Left alone, Daniel circulated carefully, gathering snippets of conversation. Blackwood Industries was in trouble. Their failed bid for Robertson Technologies had damaged investor confidence. Atlas Shipping, which Daniel had acquired through proxies 3 days before the Blackwoods could make their move, had been another devastating blow. Heard their leverage to the hilt. Maxwell's getting desperate. Might have to sell the Hampton estate. Daniel savored each morsel of gossip like fine wine. His plan was working perfectly. The Blackwoods were struggling while his own empire thrived in the shadows. Phantom Enterprises was the talk of Wall Street. An enigmatic corporation acquiring strategic assets with ruthless precision, its ownership hidden behind impenetrable legal structures. "Excuse me," a familiar voice said behind him. "Don't I know you?" Daniel turned to face Catherine. Up close, he could see the faint lines of strain around her eyes, carefully concealed beneath expertly applied makeup. "We've met," he acknowledged. "I'm surprised you remember." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "The Robertson deal. You had information that turned out to be correct." Her voice lowered. "We lost millions." "I tried to help," Daniel replied. "Your father wasn't interested." "And how exactly did you come by that information, Daniel?" Her blue eyes were penetrating, suspicious. "You've changed." Before he could respond, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A man was arguing loudly with the security staff. "That's Alan Robertson," Catherine said. "He sold his company last month to that mysterious Phantom Group for twice what we offered." Daniel feigned ignorance. "Phantom? Nobody knows who's behind it," Catherine explained, her attention still on the disturbance. "Some say it's Chinese investors. Others think it's a consortium of tech billionaires. They've been acquiring companies that we've been targeting, always one step ahead of us." "Interesting coincidence," Daniel murmured. Catherine's gaze snapped back to him, suddenly sharp and assessing. "Yes, coincidence." The moment was interrupted as Richard Blackwood stumbled toward them, clearly intoxicated. Well, he slurred. "If it isn't my sister's charity case." He looked Daniel up and down. "Still dressing from the discount rack, I see." "Richard," Catherine warned, but her brother was past the point of discretion. "You know," Richard continued, swaying slightly, "she only married you because she felt sorry for you. Daddy's little rebellion." Daniel maintained his composure. "Is that so?" "Oh yes," Richard smirked. "Catherine has a weakness for pathetic strays. But even she has standards. Tell me, what are you doing these days? Still pitching those ridiculous business ideas?" He laughed. "What was it? An app for monitoring supply chain inefficiencies. Brilliant. Because nobody's ever thought of that before." That ridiculous idea was now the cornerstone of Daniel's logistics empire, generating billions in revenue. Supply chain AI, a Reed Global subsidiary, had revolutionized inventory management across 4 continents. I get by, Daniel said mildly. Richard snorted. Gets by, he says. He turned to his sister. Kat, your ex-husband, gets by, while the rest of us actually accomplish things in life. Catherine looked uncomfortable. Richard, that's enough. No, let him speak, Daniel said. I'm interested in Richard's definition of accomplishment. Is it losing $20 million in the Singapore venture last quarter? Or perhaps it's the failed acquisition of Atlas Shipping that cost your shareholders another $30 million. Richard's face darkened. How the hell do you know about Singapore? Before Daniel could respond, Maxwell Blackwood materialized beside them, his expression thunderous. What is he doing here? Maxwell demanded, glaring at Daniel. I was invited, Daniel replied smoothly, producing his embossed invitation. Maxwell snatched it, examining the card. James Chin? You're here with James Chin. We're business associates, Daniel said. Maxwell laughed, the sound utterly devoid of humor. Business associates? James Chin runs a $100 million tech consultancy. What possible business could he have with you? I value Daniel's insights, said James, appearing beside them with impeccable timing. In fact, his analysis of the mid-cap tech market saved my clients approximately $30 million last quarter. Maxwell's expression wavered between disbelief and reluctant curiosity. Catherine was watching Daniel with new eyes, reassessing him with each passing moment. Richard merely looked confused, the alcohol hampering his ability to process this new information. Mr. Chin, Maxwell finally said, extending his hand. I've been hoping to discuss potential synergies between our companies. Perhaps another time, James replied coolly. Daniel and I have a meeting with the Zhang Consortium in 15 minutes. Their family office is looking to deploy significant capital in North American markets. Maxwell's eyes darted between James and Daniel, clearly recalculating his assessment of his former son-in-law. The Zhangs? They haven't taken meetings with anyone since their withdrawal from the Rothman deal. Things change, Daniel said simply. If you'll excuse us. As they walked away, Daniel felt Catherine's gaze burning into his back. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Soon she and her family would begin to question everything they thought they knew about the man they had so casually discarded. Outside in the limousine, James's, not one of Daniel's fleet, his friend looked at him with concern. You're enjoying this too much, James observed. Revenge is one thing, but this is becoming an obsession. Daniel watched the glittering hotel recede in the rearview mirror. This isn't just about revenge. It's about justice. Is it? James asked quietly. Or is it still about her? Daniel didn't answer, but as the car slipped into the anonymous flow of Manhattan traffic, Catherine's face lingered in his mind, not with hatred but with something far more dangerous. Possibility. Chapter 3. The headline of the Wall Street Journal screamed the news that had sent shockwaves through financial markets. Phantom Enterprises acquires controlling stake in Blackwood Shipping subsidiary. Daniel folded the newspaper carefully, savoring the moment. He had just purchased Pacific Freight, the most profitable division of Blackwood Industries, right out from under Maxwell's nose. The move had been executed through 7 different shell companies across 3 continents, untraceable to Daniel or any of his known associates. Mr. Reed, Ms. Wei is here to see you, his assistant announced through the intercom of his modest office. The space was deliberately underwhelming. A small consulting firm in a Class B building in Midtown, the perfect cover for his daily activities. Lynn entered, immaculately dressed as always, carrying a tablet loaded with the morning's financial reports. As the chief operating officer of Reed Global Ventures, she was one of only 5 people who knew Daniel's true identity as the founder and CEO of Phantom Enterprises. Pacific Freight stock is up 17%, she reported. Blackwood Industries dropped 12% on opening. Their board is calling an emergency meeting. Daniel nodded. And our offer for their technology division? Submitted through the Luxembourg entity this morning. Given their financial situation, they'll have no choice but to consider it. Lynn hesitated. There's something else. Catherine Blackwood has been making inquiries about you. Daniel's pulse quickened despite himself. What kind of inquiries? She's been contacting people in the financial sector, trying to track your career movements since your divorce. She seems particularly interested in your connection to James Chen. Let her search, Daniel said. She won't find anything we don't want her to find. Lynn's expression remained professionally neutral, but Daniel detected a hint of concern. The board meeting for Pacific Freight is tomorrow. As the new majority shareholder, Phantom needs to send a representative. I'll go myself, Daniel decided. As yourself? Lynn asked carefully. As Daniel Reed, financial consultant to Phantom Enterprises, he clarified. It's time to apply more direct pressure. The Blackwood Industries executive boardroom fell silent as Daniel entered. All eyes turned to him in confusion then disbelief. What is the meaning of this? Maxwell demanded from the head of the table. Daniel calmly took a seat at the opposite end. I'm here representing the majority shareholder of Pacific Freight. Catherine, seated at her father's right hand, stared at him with undisguised shock. Richard, nursing what appeared to be a hangover, looked up in confusion. You? Richard scoffed. A representative of Phantom? That's absurd. Daniel placed his credentials on the table. I've been retained as a consultant to evaluate the operational efficiency of this acquisition. My familiarity with Blackwood's corporate structure makes me uniquely qualified. Maxwell snatched up the documents, examining them for any sign of falsification. Finding none, his face darkened to a dangerous shade of red. This is some kind of trick, he sputtered. You're nothing. A nobody. How could you possibly? Mr. Blackwood, interrupted Howard Jensen, Blackwood's legal counsel. I've verified these credentials. Mr. Reed is indeed authorized to represent Phantom's interests. Catherine hadn't taken her eyes off Daniel. How long have you been working with Phantom? I'm not at liberty to discuss the details of my professional relationships, Daniel replied smoothly. Convenient, Richard sneered. What I can discuss, Daniel continued, are the changes Phantom intends to implement at Pacific Freight, beginning with a complete restructuring of the executive team. Maxwell slammed his fist on the table. This is my company. Daniel corrected him. Phantom now controls 62% of Pacific Freight's voting shares. These changes are not up for negotiation. He distributed folders to everyone at the table. You'll find the transition plan outlined in detail. Key personnel will be retained based on merit, not seniority or family connections. Richard flipped through the document, his face growing paler by the second. This is a bloodbath, Catherine finished for him, her voice steady despite the shock evident in her expression. You're dismantling our entire management structure. Ineffective management is what drove Pacific Freight's valuation down to the point where it became an acquisition target, Daniel pointed out. Phantom intends to restore its profitability. Maxwell stood abruptly. I will fight this with every resource at my disposal. That would be unwise, Daniel replied. Especially given Blackwood Industries' current financial vulnerability. I understand you're having difficulty meeting the covenants on your primary credit facility. The stunned silence confirmed his intelligence was accurate. How could you possibly know that? Howard Jensen asked, visibly disturbed by the leak of such sensitive information. Daniel smiled thinly. It's my job to know. Catherine was studying him with a mixture of suspicion and something else. Perhaps a reluctant admiration. You've changed, Daniel, she said softly. This isn't the man I knew. The man you knew wasn't allowed in this boardroom, Daniel replied, meeting her gaze directly. Except when he was being escorted out by security. Maxwell's face contorted with rage. Get out. Get out before I have you thrown out. Daniel collected his papers unhurriedly. That would be a serious breach of fiduciary responsibility, Mr. Blackwood. Phantom wouldn't look kindly on such an action. He stood and buttoned his jacket, still modestly priced but now perfectly tailored. A small detail that didn't escape Catherine's notice. I'll be back tomorrow to begin the transition process, Daniel informed them. Please ensure your executive team is available for individual assessments. As he walked toward the door, Catherine called after him. Daniel, who is behind Phantom? You can tell me that much, can't you? He paused, turning slightly. Someone who understands the value of patience, Mrs. Blackwood, and the true cost of underestimating people. The door closed behind him with a soft final click. Outside in the hallway, Daniel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The look on Maxwell's face had been everything he'd dreamed of during those dark nights 3 years ago when, penniless and humiliated, he'd slept in his car while plotting his return. His phone vibrated. "Lynn. How did it go?" she asked. "Exactly as expected," Daniel replied. "They're stunned, angry, and completely off balance." "The technology division offer?" "They'll take it," Daniel said confidently. "They have no choice. Their debt obligations come due next quarter, and no bank will extend their credit lines now." "And after that?" Lynn's voice held a note of concern. "Daniel, you've already achieved what you set out to do. Blackwood Industries is on the verge of collapse. Maybe it's time to reveal yourself and end this." Daniel watched through the glass partition as the Blackwood family argued furiously in the boardroom, Maxwell's face purple with rage, Richard gesticulating wildly, Catherine sitting very still, her eyes fixed on the door through which Daniel had just exited. "Not yet," he said softly. "They still don't understand what they did. What it cost me. I want them to feel what I felt, complete and utter helplessness. I want them to know what it's like to lose everything." "And then what?" Lynn pressed. "What happens when they're broken and you've revealed yourself as the architect of their destruction? What will that achieve?" Daniel had no answer. The truth was he didn't know what came after revenge. He'd been focused for so long on this moment, on bringing the Blackwoods to their knees, that he'd given little thought to what would follow. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of Catherine exiting the boardroom. Their eyes met across the hallway. She hesitated, then began walking toward him with purposeful strides. "I need to go," he told Lynn, ending the call as Catherine approached. "Daniel," she said, slightly breathless. "We need to talk. I've said all I came to say in the boardroom. Not about Pacific Freight." Her blue eyes searched his face. "About you. About what happened to you after you discarded me?" Daniel supplied. "After your father had security drag me out of the building? After you stood by and watched it happen?" Catherine flinched. "I made a terrible mistake," she admitted. "I was young and afraid and now I'm useful again," Daniel interrupted coldly. "Now that I represent Phantom, suddenly I'm worth talking to." "That's not fair," Catherine protested. "I've been thinking about you for months, even before all this. I tried to find you but you disappeared." "I had to," Daniel said. "Your family made sure I couldn't get work anywhere in the financial sector. Your father blacklisted me with every connection he had." Catherine's eyes widened. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Daniel countered. "You were too busy enjoying your privileged life to wonder what happened to the man you promised to love for better or worse." The elevator dinged, offering a timely escape. Daniel stepped toward it. "Daniel, please," Catherine caught his arm. "Give me a chance to make it right." He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, remembering a time when her touch had meant everything to him. Now it left him feeling nothing. Or so he told himself. "Some things can't be made right, Catherine," he said quietly, disengaging from her grip. "Some betrayals cut too deep." The elevator doors closed on her stricken face, and Daniel leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. The Blackwoods were reeling, their empire beginning to crumble. Soon, very soon, he would deliver the final blow. Yet Catherine's words echoed in his mind, raising a question he'd avoided for 3 years. When this was over, when he'd taken everything from them as they had taken everything from him, would it be enough? The elevator reached the lobby and Daniel stepped out into the sunlight, pushing the doubt away. It had to be enough. Because revenge was all he had left. Chapter 4. The weeks following the Pacific Freight acquisition passed in a blur of strategic maneuvers. Daniel methodically dismantled the corrupt and inefficient management structure, replacing key positions with his own people while maintaining his cover as a mere consultant. Each day brought new opportunities to demonstrate his competence in front of the Blackwoods, who watched with increasing disbelief as their former scapegoat transformed their failing shipping division into a model of efficiency. Quarterly projections show a 38% increase in profitability, Daniel announced during the executive meeting, deliberately understating the actual 43% improvement. Let them be surprised when the official numbers came in even better. Maxwell Blackwood sat at the far end of the table, his once commanding presence diminished by recent events. The technology division sale to Phantom had gone through last week, further weakening his grip on the company he'd built. Impossible, Richard muttered, though without his usual conviction. Recent events had forced him to acknowledge that Daniel was far more capable than they had ever given him credit for. The numbers speak for themselves, Daniel replied, sliding the reports across the polished mahogany. Pacific Freight hasn't seen performance like this in a decade. Catherine, who had been notably quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke. What changed? The infrastructure is the same. The market conditions haven't improved. What exactly did you implement that we hadn't already tried? Daniel allowed himself a small smile. I listened to the people actually doing the work, Mrs. Blackwood. 3 years ago, I proposed a logistics optimization system based on interviews with your dock supervisors and transportation managers. A proposal your father dismissed as theoretical nonsense from someone who's never shipped so much as a postcard. All eyes turned to Maxwell, whose face darkened with the memory. That system, Daniel continued, has now reduced turnaround times at all 7 Pacific Freight terminals by an average of 23%. The same system your father called, what was it again? Ah yes, the delusional ramblings of an overeducated paperboy. The boardroom fell uncomfortably silent. Several executives shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact with the Blackwoods. If you'll excuse me, Maxwell finally said, standing abruptly, I have another engagement. He strode from the room without another word, the weight of his miscalculation visible in his stiff shoulders. As the meeting concluded, Daniel gathered his materials, aware of Catherine watching him intently. She had been seeking private conversations with him for weeks, but he had skillfully avoided being alone with her. Today, however, she was too quick. Daniel, she said, intercepting him at the door. Can we speak privately? I have another meeting, he replied coolly. Please, Catherine said, her composure slipping slightly. Just 5 minutes. Something in her tone, a vulnerability he'd rarely heard from her, made him hesitate. 5 minutes, he agreed reluctantly. She led him to a small conference room and closed the door behind them. You're destroying my family, she said without preamble. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I'm improving the performance of a company that your family ran into the ground through mismanagement and nepotism. That's not what I mean, and you know it. Catherine's blue eyes flashed with sudden intensity. This is personal for you. Phantom acquiring our core businesses one after another. This isn't coincidence. What are you suggesting? I think you know exactly who's behind Phantom, Catherine said. I think you're working with them deliberately to target us. Daniel maintained his neutral expression. That's quite a conspiracy theory. Is it? Catherine stepped closer. 3 years ago I treated you terribly. I've regretted it every day since. But this systematic dismantling of everything my father built, it's calculated. Precise. As if someone knows exactly where to strike for maximum damage. Perhaps your father simply made powerful enemies, Daniel suggested. That tends to happen when you treat people as disposable. Catherine's gaze never wavered. There's something else. Something that's been bothering me since the charity gala. What's that? You knew about the Singapore losses before they were public. You knew about our interest in Atlas shipping. You even predicted our approach to Robertson Technologies. She took another step toward him. No mere consultant has access to that kind of internal information. Daniel felt a flicker of concern. Catherine had always been perceptive. It was one of the qualities that had attracted him to her initially. The financial world is smaller than you think, he said dismissively. People talk. No, Catherine shook her head. This is different. Personal. She searched his face. What happened to you after you left, Daniel? Where did you go? For a moment, Daniel was tempted to tell her everything. How he'd slept in his car for weeks after their divorce. How her father's blacklisting had made it impossible to find work in finance. How he'd finally landed a job as a night security guard at a tech startup, where he'd overheard the founders discussing a supply chain problem he knew how to solve. He wanted to tell her about the risk James Chin had taken on him, investing in his logistics software when no one else would. About the 18-hour days and sleepless nights building his company from nothing. About the moment he realized he'd become wealthy enough to begin his systematic dismantling of the Blackwood empire. Instead, he checked his watch. Your 5 minutes are up, Daniel. I have a meeting with the new CTO of the technology division, he interrupted. Phantom has ambitious plans for the restructuring. Catherine's expression hardened. You know who they are. You're working with them to destroy us. Your family is destroying itself, Daniel replied. I'm just watching it happen. As he turned to leave, Catherine called after him. I know you, Daniel. Better than you think. This isn't you, this calculated cruelty. He paused at the door. You never knew me, Catherine. You saw what you wanted to see. A charity case, a project, your act of rebellion against Daddy. The real me wasn't interesting enough for you. That's not true, she whispered. I loved you. Daniel looked back at her, allowing a glimpse of his true feelings to show through his carefully maintained facade. Not enough to stand by me when it mattered. He left her standing there, his heart pounding with emotions he'd thought long buried. Catherine was getting too close to the truth. The game was becoming dangerous. Outside, in his modest car, still maintaining his cover, Daniel called Lynn. We need to accelerate the timetable, he said without preamble. Catherine is asking too many questions. The Harbinger deal isn't ready, Lynn cautioned. We need at least 2 more weeks to finalize the terms. Harbinger Capital was the final piece of Daniel's puzzle. A massive private equity firm preparing to make a hostile takeover bid for what remained of Blackwood Industries. Once that happened, the Blackwoods would lose everything just as Daniel had. Make it happen faster, he ordered. I want the offer announced by the end of next week. After ending the call, Daniel sat motionless behind the wheel, troubled by his encounter with Catherine. For 3 years he'd nurtured his resentment, allowing it to harden into a diamond-sharp focus that had driven every decision. Now, faced with the reality of Catherine's regret, he felt the first hairline cracks in his resolve. Was this really justice, or had it become something darker? The thought lasted only a moment before he pushed it aside. The Blackwoods had shown him no mercy. He would show them none in return. Starting the car, Daniel pulled into the midtown traffic, unaware that Catherine was watching him from the window above, her phone pressed to her ear. I need everything you can find on Daniel Reed, she was saying. Financial records, employment history, property holdings. Everything. I don't care what it costs or how many people you have to hire. Something isn't adding up and I need to know what it is before we lose everything. Chapter 5. The private investigator's report landed on Catherine's desk with a soft thud that belied its explosive contents. This can't be right, she murmured, flipping through the pages for the 3rd time. There's nothing here. Marta Santos, the investigator she'd hired at considerable expense, shrugged apologetically. That's just it, Miss Blackwood. There's nothing to find. Daniel Reed effectively ceased to exist 3 years ago. Everyone leaves a trail, Catherine insisted. Credit cards, rent payments, utility bills. Something. Not Mr. Reed, Marta replied. After your divorce, he disappeared completely from the financial system for approximately 6 months. No credit activity, no rental agreements, no employment records. It's as if he vanished. Catherine frowned. And after those 6 months? He reappears working for a small tech startup called Logicor as a security guard. Night shift. Minimum wage. From there his rise is meteoric but peculiar. Peculiar how? Marta pointed to a timeline in the report. Within 3 months at Logicor he's promoted to logistics consultant. 3 months after that he leaves to found his own company Reed Solutions with seed funding from James Chin. Catherine finished, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Exactly. Reed Solutions specializes in supply chain optimization software, remarkably similar to the system he's implemented at Pacific Freight. The company grows quickly, but its client list is suspiciously vague, and its financial statements show revenues inconsistent with its apparent size and influence. Catherine leaned back in her chair, processing this information. A front, she said softly. Reed Solutions is a shell company. Marta nodded. Almost certainly. Mr. Reed maintains a modest apartment in Brooklyn and drives a 10-year-old Honda, despite his company supposedly generating millions in revenue. His personal finances reflect the lifestyle of a moderately successful consultant, not a tech entrepreneur. What about his connection to Phantom? Officially, he's contracted through a series of intermediary consulting firms. The paper trail is impressively complex, designed to obscure rather than clarify. Catherine stood and walked to the window looking out at the Manhattan skyline. He's hiding something. Something big. Miss Blackwood, Marta said carefully, given the timing of Phantom's emergence and Mr. Reed's mysterious financial situation, I believe there may be a more direct connection than merely a consulting relationship. Catherine turned, her expression sharpening. You think he works for whoever is behind Phantom? Marta hesitated, then went further. I think there's a non-zero probability that Mr. Reed is Phantom, or at least a principal architect of it. The suggestion should have seemed absurd. 3 years ago, Daniel had been escorted from the building with nothing but the clothes on his back. Now Marta was suggesting he controlled a multi-billion-dollar enterprise systematically dismantling the Blackwood family's business empire. Yet somehow, Catherine wasn't as shocked as she should have been. There had always been something about Daniel, a quiet intensity, an analytical brilliance that her father had mistaken for academic arrogance. She had recognized his potential even then, though she'd failed to defend it when it mattered most. What would you need to confirm this theory? Catherine asked. Access, Marta replied simply. To his communication devices, his personal records. Something to connect him directly to Phantom's operations. Catherine thought for a moment, then made a decision. Get me everything you can on Reed Solutions' office. Floor plans, security systems, cleaning schedules. Everything. If Daniel is hiding something, that's where we'll find it. The Reed Solutions office occupied a modest suite in a converted industrial building in Brooklyn's Dumbo neighborhood. From the outside, it appeared to be exactly what it claimed. A successful but unremarkable consulting firm specializing in supply chain optimization. Catherine adjusted her delivery uniform, complete with logo-emblazoned cap and clipboard, and checked her reflection in a compact mirror. The disguise was hardly sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. No one looked twice at delivery personnel. The cleaning crew leaves at 9:30 p.m., Marta's voice crackled through the nearly invisible earpiece. Security does rounds at the top of every hour. You'll have approximately 45 minutes once you're inside. Understood, Catherine murmured, approaching the service entrance with practiced confidence. The security guard barely glanced at her forged delivery slip before buzzing her in. 3 years in the Blackwood family business had taught Catherine how to move through the world with the entitlement that made people question nothing. Following Marta's directions, she navigated to the 3rd floor, where Reed Solutions maintained its offices. The hallway was dimly lit, most of the neighboring businesses already closed for the evening. Suite 312, Marta confirmed in her ear. Standard commercial-grade lock. The bypass tool is in your right pocket. Catherine had never broken into an office before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Her family's company, her inheritance, her future, was being systematically dismantled. If Daniel was connected to Phantom, she needed proof. The lock yielded with surprising ease. Catherine slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her. Reed Solutions was unexpectedly austere. No expensive artwork adorned the walls. No designer furniture filled the reception area. It was functional, efficient, much like Daniel himself. Head for the main office at the back, Marta instructed. According to the building plans, that should be Reed's personal space. Catherine moved quickly through the darkened office, past clustered workstations and a small conference room. Daniel's office was locked, a higher-grade lock than the main entrance. This is different, Catherine whispered, examining the keypad. Electronic access, Marta confirmed. Try the bypass sequence I gave you. The first sequence failed. So did the second. It's not working, Catherine hissed, glancing nervously at her watch. 20 minutes gone already. Try March 17, 19, came Marta's suggestion. Catherine punched in the numbers. The lock clicked open. How did you know that? She asked, slipping inside. It's your wedding anniversary, Marta replied simply. Something twisted in Catherine's chest. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. She pushed the feeling aside and focused on the task at hand. Daniel's office was as Spartan as the rest of the space. A desk, ergonomic chair, 2 visitor seats, and a wall of bookshelves filled with technical manuals. A single framed photograph sat on the desk, facing away from her. Catherine began methodically searching through drawers, looking for anything connecting Daniel to Phantom. The first 2 yielded nothing but standard office supplies and company paperwork. The bottom drawer was locked. Another locked drawer, she reported. No keypad this time. Check under the desk, Marta suggested. Classic hiding spot for a key. Sure enough, Catherine's fingers found a small key taped to the underside of the desk. The drawer slid open to reveal a single manila folder labeled Project Nemesis. Her heart racing, Catherine opened the folder. Inside was a detailed organizational chart of Blackwood Industries, with red X's marked through subsidiaries that had already been acquired by Phantom. Pacific Freight and the Technology Division were crossed out. Next on the list, circled in red, Blackwood Capital, the family's private investment arm and the source of most of their remaining wealth. Oh my God, Catherine breathed. He's targeting us systematically. But the real shock came when she turned the page. There, in precise detail, was a complete breakdown of Blackwood Industries' financial vulnerabilities, including private banking information that nobody outside the family and their most trusted advisors should have had access to. He knows everything, she whispered. Every weakness, every pressure point. As she continued flipping through the documents, a name caught her eye: Harbinger Capital. According to the briefing, they were preparing a hostile takeover bid for Blackwood's remaining assets, scheduled to be announced next week. Marta, I need to document this, Catherine said urgently, pulling out her phone. Make it quick, Marta warned. Security will be doing rounds in 10 minutes. Catherine began photographing the documents rapidly, her mind racing. This was it, proof that Daniel was orchestrating their downfall. But why? Revenge seemed too simple an explanation for something this elaborate, this meticulous. As she replaced the folder and locked the drawer, her gaze fell on the framed photograph she'd noticed earlier. Curiosity got the better of her and she turned it to face her. It wasn't a corporate award or family photo as she'd expected. It was a picture of Catherine herself, taken on their honeymoon in Santorini. Her hair was blowing in the wind, her smile radiant as she gazed out at the azure sea. Catherine stared at the photo, momentarily frozen. Of all the things Daniel could have kept, this was what sat on his desk. Catherine, you need to move, Marta's urgent voice broke through her reverie. Security is on your floor. Hastily, Catherine returned the photograph to its original position and slipped out of the office, locking it behind her. She had almost reached the main entrance when the security guard's flashlight beams swept through the frosted glass. Thinking quickly, she ducked into the small kitchen area just as the door opened. Hello, the guard called. Anyone still here? Catherine held her breath, pressing herself against the wall beside the refrigerator. The flashlight beam passed over the kitchen entrance but didn't penetrate the dark corner where she stood. After what seemed like an eternity, the guard completed his check and left, the door clicking shut behind him. He's gone, Marta confirmed. Get out now. Catherine didn't need to be told twice. She slipped out of the office and retraced her steps to the service entrance, her mind still reeling from what she'd discovered. Daniel wasn't just working for Phantom. He was orchestrating a meticulously planned revenge against her family. And yet he kept her photograph on his desk. The contradiction was maddening. Back in her car, she reviewed the photos she'd taken. This is definitive, Marta said, examining the images on Catherine's phone. Reed is clearly involved in a coordinated effort to dismantle Blackwood Industries. But why? Catherine asked, more to herself than to Marta. This goes beyond simple revenge. Doesn't it? Marta raised an eyebrow. Your father humiliated him publicly, blacklisted him in the industry, took away his livelihood. Your brother mocked him relentlessly. And you? I abandoned him, Catherine finished quietly. People have destroyed empires for less, Marta observed. Catherine stared out at the Brooklyn skyline, illuminated against the night sky. So what do I do with this information? That depends, Marta replied. What do you want to achieve? Do you want to expose him? Stop him? Or what? Marta gave her a measured look. Or understand him. Catherine thought about the photograph on Daniel's desk. Her face, captured in a moment of perfect happiness, kept close at hand despite everything that had happened between them. I need to confront him, she decided. Not to accuse but to understand. There's something here I'm missing. Be careful, Marta warned. From what we've seen, Daniel Reed is not the man you married. He's become someone much more dangerous. Catherine nodded, starting the car. That's exactly why I need to talk to him. The Daniel I knew couldn't have orchestrated something this elaborate. I need to know what happened to him, what changed him. As she pulled into traffic, her phone buzzed with a message from her father. Emergency board meeting tomorrow. Harbinger Capital rumors. Be there. It was happening even faster than Daniel's documents had indicated. The final assault on the Blackwood Empire was beginning, and Catherine was caught between loyalty to her family and a growing, uncomfortable awareness of their culpability in creating their own nemesis. She had less than 24 hours to decide what to do. Chapter 6. The Blackwood Industries boardroom crackled with tension. Maxwell paced at the head of the table, his face flushed with a dangerous combination of rage and fear. Richard sat slumped in his chair, unusually subdued. The remaining board members exchanged nervous glances, sensing the impending doom. It's a coordinated attack, Maxwell was saying as Catherine slipped into her seat. First Pacific Freight, then the technology division. Now Harbinger is making noise about a hostile takeover. The timing is suspicious, agreed Howard Jensen, still loyal despite the company's declining fortunes. These moves are too precisely targeted to be coincidence. Catherine remained silent, the photographed documents from Daniel's office burning a hole in her phone. She had spent a sleepless night debating what to do with the information. We need to identify who's behind Phantom, Maxwell continued. Someone is pulling the strings, feeding them insider information about our vulnerabilities. Perhaps, Catherine said carefully, we should consider that our vulnerabilities existed regardless of who exploited them. All eyes turned to her in surprise. What exactly are you suggesting, Catherine? Maxwell asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm suggesting that Pacific Freight was mismanaged for years before Phantom acquired it. The technology division was hemorrhaging money because we failed to innovate. She met her father's gaze steadily. Perhaps instead of looking for conspiracies, we should acknowledge our own failures. Richard snorted. Listen to her. One conversation with her ex-husband and suddenly she's taking his side. This isn't about taking sides, Catherine replied sharply. It's about facing reality. Daniel has implemented changes at Pacific Freight that we should have made years ago. Changes he actually suggested when he worked here. Maxwell's expression darkened. Daniel Reed is a consultant, nothing more. Any success at Pacific Freight is due to Phantom's resources, not his ideas. Are you sure about that? Catherine challenged. Because from what I've seen, he's been remarkably effective for just a consultant. Before her father could respond, his assistant burst into the room. Sir, Harbinger Capital has just issued a press release. They're offering to buy controlling interest in Blackwood Capital at 40% above market value, conditional on completion within 72 hours. The room erupted in chaos. Board members shouted questions and demands. Richard knocked over his water glass in shock. Through it all, Maxwell stood frozen, his empire crumbling around him. In the confusion, Catherine slipped out, pulling her phone from her pocket. She had made her decision. Daniel was reviewing quarterly projections in his office at Reed Solutions when his private line rang. A number only 5 people in the world possessed. Reed, he answered tersely. It's me, Catherine's voice came through clearly. We need to talk. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. How did you get this number? That's not important, she replied. What's important is that I know Daniel. I know everything. A cold sensation spread through his chest. I don't know what you're talking about. Project Nemesis, Catherine said simply. Harbinger Capital. The systematic dismantling of my family's company. Your revenge. Daniel's mind raced. How could she possibly know about Project Nemesis? The only copy of those documents was locked in his desk drawer. Where are you? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. Riverside Park, near the 79th Street Boat Basin. I'm alone. Pause. Are you going to deny it? Daniel checked his watch. The Harbinger announcement had gone out 20 minutes ago, exactly as planned. By tomorrow, the Blackwoods would be facing their final downfall. Stay there, he said. I'll be there in 30 minutes. He ended the call and immediately dialed Lynn. We have a situation, he began, but Lynn interrupted him. I know. Catherine Blackwood broke into your office last night. She has photographs of the Project Nemesis documents. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The security cameras. I should have checked them. I only discovered it during the routine security review this morning, Lynn explained. She was disguised, but facial recognition confirmed it was her. Daniel, she knows everything. Not everything, Daniel replied grimly. Not yet. What are you going to do? Daniel considered his options. The endgame was already in motion. In 72 hours, Harbinger would complete the takeover of Blackwood Capital, and the Blackwood family would lose their final source of wealth and power. His revenge would be complete. But Catherine knew, and somehow that changed things. I'm going to meet her, he decided. Is that wise? Lynn sounded concerned. She could expose you, ruin everything we've built. Or, Daniel said quietly, she could be the one person who deserves to know the truth before the end. After ending the call, Daniel sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the photograph on his desk. Catherine in Santorini, captured in a moment of perfect happiness before everything fell apart. He had kept it as a reminder of what had been taken from him, a talisman to fuel his resolve when doubts crept in. Now it seemed like something else entirely, a relic of a different life, a different Daniel. With sudden decisiveness he stood, grabbed his coat and headed for the door. It was time to face Catherine, not as Daniel Reed, humble consultant, but as the architect of her family's destruction. Riverside Park was relatively quiet for a weekday afternoon. Catherine sat on a bench overlooking the Hudson, watching the boats drift past. She didn't turn when Daniel approached, though she sensed his presence immediately. You're late, she said. Traffic. He remained standing, maintaining distance between them. You said you know everything. Now Catherine looked up at him, her blue eyes sharp with accusation. You're phantom. Or at least you control it. You've been systematically targeting my family's businesses for the past year. Daniel neither confirmed nor denied it. Why did you call me instead of telling your father? Because I want to understand, Catherine replied. This isn't just business for you. It's personal, methodical, patient destruction. I want to know why. You know why, Daniel said coldly. Your father humiliated me. Your family discarded me when I was no longer useful. He stopped, unwilling to voice the deepest betrayal. I abandoned you, Catherine finished for him. I chose my family over you. I was a coward. She stood to face him directly. But this? Creating a multi-billion-dollar empire just to destroy ours? That goes beyond revenge, Daniel. That's obsession. Call it what you want, Daniel replied. In 3 days it will be finished. Harbinger will complete the acquisition of Blackwood Capital, and your family will lose everything, just as I lost everything 3 years ago. Catherine stepped closer to him, searching his face. And then what? Will it heal whatever broke inside you? Will it make you happy? The question caught Daniel off guard. The truth was he didn't know. For 3 years, every waking moment had been dedicated to this plan. Building his fortune, creating Phantom, positioning himself to dismantle the Blackwood Empire piece by piece. He had given no thought to what came after. It will bring justice, he said finally. Justice, Catherine repeated. Is that what this is? She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, showing him the photograph she'd taken of his desk. Then explain this. Why keep my picture, Daniel? If I'm just another target in your revenge plot, why keep this reminder of us? Daniel stared at the image, feeling something crack in the armor he'd built around himself. I don't know, he admitted quietly. Catherine's expression softened slightly. I think you do know. I think beneath all this calculation and revenge, there's still the Daniel I fell in love with. The man who was kind and brilliant and saw the best in people, even in me. That man is gone, Daniel said harshly. Your family killed him. No. Catherine shook her head. He's still there. The Daniel I knew wouldn't have built all this just for destruction. He would have built it to create something better, to prove everyone wrong, yes, but also to make something meaningful. She was right, though Daniel was loath to admit it. Reed Global Ventures hadn't started as an instrument of revenge. It had begun with a genuine innovation, the supply chain optimization system that the Blackwoods had rejected, and a desire to prove its value to the world. Somewhere along the way, success had twisted into something darker, the means to exact retribution. It's too late, Daniel said after a long moment. The Harbinger deal is done. In 3 days your family loses everything. Unless you stop it, Catherine replied. You created this situation. You can undo it. Daniel laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Why would I do that? Why would I spare the people who showed me no mercy? Not for them, Catherine said softly. For yourself. For the man you were, the man you could be again. She reached out tentatively, her fingers just brushing his sleeve. For us. Daniel looked at her hand, then back to her face. There is no us, Catherine. You made that clear 3 years ago. I made a terrible mistake, she admitted. I've regretted it every day since. But this, what you're doing, it's a mistake too. It won't heal what happened. It will only create more pain. For a brief moment, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a different outcome. One where he revealed himself not as his enemy's destroyer but as a self-made success story. Where he could look Maxwell Blackwood in the eye as an equal, not through the lens of revenge. But the memory of his humiliation, of being escorted from the building while Catherine stood by silently, was too powerful to ignore. I have a meeting, he said abruptly, stepping back from her touch. Harbinger's executives are expecting my final authorization. So that's it. Catherine's voice held a note of desperation. You'll destroy my family, destroy any chance of reconciliation between us, just to satisfy your need for revenge? Daniel met her gaze steadily. Your family destroyed me without a second thought. Consider this the consequence of their actions. As he turned to leave, Catherine called after him. The man in that photograph, the man I loved, he wouldn't do this. He was better than that. Daniel paused, her words hitting him with unexpected force. Then, without looking back, he continued walking, each step heavy with the weight of a decision not yet fully made. Back in his car, he sat motionless, Catherine's words echoing in his mind. His phone buzzed insistently, Lynn calling for the 3rd time. Yes, he answered. The Harbinger board is waiting for your final approval on the acquisition terms, Lynn reported. They need your signature within the hour to proceed. Daniel stared out at the Hudson River, watching the light play across its surface. 3 years of meticulous planning had led to this moment, the final blow that would bring the Blackwoods to their knees. Yet Catherine's question lingered. And then what? Daniel. Lynn prompted. What should I tell them? He made his decision. Tell them I'll be there shortly, he said. There's something I need to do first. Chapter 7. The Blackwood estate stood on 2 manicured acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, a colonial mansion that had been in the family for generations. Daniel had visited only once during his marriage to Catherine, for a tense Thanksgiving dinner where Maxwell had spent the entire evening subtly reminding Daniel of his inadequacy. Now, as his Bentley crunched up the gravel driveway, no need to maintain the facade of poverty anymore. Daniel felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Once again he was entering enemy territory, only this time he held all the power. The housekeeper who answered the door clearly didn't recognize him, which was hardly surprising given his transformation. I'm here to see Maxwell Blackwood, he said. It's regarding Harbinger Capital. He'll want to speak with me. She showed him to Maxwell's study, a wood-paneled sanctuary filled with leather-bound books and hunting trophies, the stereotypical retreat of old money. Maxwell looked up from his desk with irritation that quickly transformed to shock when he recognized his visitor. You, he spat, rising to his feet. How dare you come to my home? Sit down, Maxwell, Daniel replied calmly. What I have to say will take approximately 5 minutes. After that I'll leave and never darken your door again, if that's what you want. Something in Daniel's tone, the absolute confidence, the subtle threat, made Maxwell sink slowly back into his chair. Say what you came to say, then get out, the older man growled. Daniel remained standing, wanting the psychological advantage of height. I am Phantom, he said without preamble. Maxwell stared at him in disbelief, then barked a harsh laugh. You. Impossible. 3 years ago you had security escort me from Blackwood Industries, Daniel continued, unmoved by the denial. You blacklisted me throughout the financial industry. You told Catherine I was beneath her, that she'd made a terrible mistake in marrying me. You called me, I believe, a parasite with delusions of competence. Maxwell's face darkened at the recitation of his past cruelty, but he remained silent. What you didn't know, Daniel went on, was that the supply chain optimization system I'd been developing, the one you dismissed as theoretical nonsense, was actually revolutionary. James Chin recognized its potential immediately when we met by chance at a tech conference. He invested $2 million in my idea. Daniel paced slowly across the study, noting with satisfaction how Maxwell's eyes tracked him with growing unease. Reed Global Ventures now generates annual revenues exceeding $4 billion. Our client list includes 8 Fortune 100 companies. The logistics software you mocked is now the industry standard. Daniel paused, letting the information sink in. And 2 years ago, I created Phantom Enterprises specifically to acquire Blackwood assets. Maxwell's face had gone pale. Why are you telling me this now? Because in 1 hour, I'm meeting with Harbinger Capital to finalize their takeover of Blackwood Capital, your last remaining asset of any significant value. Daniel checked his watch deliberately. Once that happens, the Blackwood family fortune will effectively cease to exist. You son of a bitch, Maxwell whispered, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until the knuckles turned white. This was all about revenge. Initially, yes, Daniel acknowledged. I wanted you to feel what I felt. The utter helplessness of having everything stripped away. I wanted you to know what it was like to be deemed worthless. And now you've come to gloat, Maxwell said bitterly. To watch me squirm before you deliver the killing blow. No, Daniel replied. I've come to offer you a choice. From his briefcase, Daniel withdrew 2 folders and placed them on Maxwell's desk. The blue folder contains the terms of the Harbinger acquisition, which will proceed as planned. Your family will retain perhaps 5% of your current net worth, enough to live comfortably but without the power and influence you've wielded for decades. Maxwell glared at the folder as if it might bite him. The red folder, Daniel continued, contains an alternative proposal. Pacific Freight and the technology division remain under Phantom's control, but we enter a joint venture with what remains of Blackwood Industries. Your company survives, albeit in a significantly diminished form. Maxwell looked up sharply. Why would you offer this? You have us at your mercy. Because destroying you won't undo what happened 3 years ago, Daniel said quietly. It won't change the past or heal old wounds. It will simply create new ones. The admission cost him something to make aloud, but Catherine's words in the park had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The man he had been, the man who had fallen in love with Catherine, would indeed have been better than this. There's a catch, Maxwell guessed, eyeing the red folder suspiciously. Several, Daniel confirmed. First, you step down as CEO immediately. Richard is removed from all operational roles. The board will be restructured with independent directors comprising the majority. Maxwell's face flushed with anger. You want to strip me of my company. I want to save what's left of it, Daniel corrected him. Your leadership is what brought Blackwood Industries to this precipice. Continued decline is inevitable unless dramatic changes are made. And the other conditions? Daniel met the older man's gaze directly. You acknowledge publicly that the ideas you rejected 3 years ago were in fact viable. You admit that your judgment was clouded by personal prejudice rather than business acumen. Maxwell's pride visibly rebelled against this demand. You want me to humiliate myself. I want you to face the truth, Daniel replied. Just as I had to face the truth that I wasn't good enough for your daughter in your eyes, not because of my ideas or abilities, but because of where I came from. For a long moment, Maxwell said nothing, absorbing the full weight of Daniel's words. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its bluster. And if I refuse? Then Harbinger acquires everything as planned, and the Blackwood name becomes a cautionary tale in business schools. Daniel checked his watch again. You have 30 minutes to decide. Maxwell stared at the 2 folders, the choice before him clearly agonizing. Does Catherine know about this? No, Daniel admitted. She knows I'm Phantom, but not about this offer. Why? Maxwell asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Why offer us any lifeline at all? Daniel considered the question carefully. Because 3 years ago I let you define me by your rejection. Everything I've built since then, Reed Global, Phantom, all of it, has been a response to that moment. I don't want to be defined by you anymore, Maxwell. Not by your rejection then, and not by my revenge now. Something shifted in Maxwell's expression. A grudging respect, perhaps, or simply resignation. You've become a formidable man, Daniel. I underestimated you, we all did. Something shifted in Maxwell's expression. A grudging respect, perhaps, or simply resignation. You've become a formidable man, Daniel. I underestimated you, we all did. Yes, Daniel agreed simply. You did. Maxwell reached for the red folder, opening it slowly. I need to review the terms with my lawyers. You have 30 minutes, Daniel repeated. After that, I meet with Harbinger and this offer disappears. As Maxwell began reading through the document, the study door opened. Catherine stood in the doorway, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness as she took in the scene. Daniel, she said cautiously. What are you doing here? Offering your father a choice, Daniel replied. The destruction of your family's company, or its partial salvation. Catherine looked to her father, who seemed suddenly older, diminished by the weight of the decision before him. Dad. Maxwell gestured to the chair beside him. He's Phantom, Catherine. He's been behind everything, Pacific Freight, the technology division, all of it. And now he's offering us terms. Catherine turned to Daniel, her eyes searching his face. You came here to negotiate? Not to destroy. I came to finish this, one way or another, Daniel said. The choice is your father's. Maxwell looked up from the documents. These terms are punitive. They're fair, Daniel countered. Your company survives. Your family retains significant wealth. The Blackwood name continues. Catherine moved to her father's side, scanning the proposal over his shoulder. He's right, Dad. This is more than fair given the circumstances. You're taking his side? Maxwell asked incredulously. I'm acknowledging reality, Catherine replied firmly. Daniel built something extraordinary after we discarded him. We were wrong, you were wrong, and this is the consequence. He turned to Daniel. But this isn't just business for you, is it? This is personal, for both of us. Daniel met her gaze steadily. The two can't be separated anymore. The room fell silent as Maxwell continued reading the agreement, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set the document down and looked up at Daniel. You've won, he said simply. I'll sign your agreement, step down as CEO, remove Richard from operations. I'll even make your public statement acknowledging my misjudgment. Daniel nodded, feeling not triumph but a strange emptiness. This was victory, yet it tasted nothing like he'd imagined during those dark nights planning his revenge. But I want one addition to the terms, Maxwell continued. What's that? Daniel asked warily. Maxwell glanced at Catherine, then back to Daniel. Whatever happens between you and my daughter, and I suspect something will, it remains separate from business. No matter how your personal relationship evolves, the terms of this agreement stand unchanged. Daniel blinked in surprise. It was perhaps the first time Maxwell had ever acknowledged the reality of his relationship with Catherine, not as a passing rebellious phase, but as something genuine and meaningful. Agreed, Daniel said after a moment. Catherine looked between the two men with a mixture of bewilderment and cautious hope. So that's it? Peace. Not peace, Daniel corrected her. A truce. With very specific terms. Maxwell extended his hand across the desk. A truce then. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then took the offered hand. The handshake was brief but firm, an acknowledgement between adversaries if not quite forgiveness. As Daniel prepared to leave, Catherine followed him to the door. What you did today, she said quietly, choosing negotiation over destruction, that was the Daniel I remembered. The man I loved. Daniel looked at her, allowing himself for the first time to remember not just the betrayal of their ending, but the joy of their beginning, the way Catherine had once looked at him with admiration rather than pity, with love rather than regret. That man is still finding his way back, he said finally. When he does, Catherine replied, I'd like to get to know him again. Daniel nodded, not committing to anything but not refusing either. Goodbye, Catherine. For now, she added softly. Outside, as Daniel walked to his car, he found himself taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. For 3 years, every waking moment had been consumed by thoughts of revenge, by the meticulous construction of his plan to destroy the Blackwoods. Now that plan had been abandoned, replaced by something more complex but potentially more healing. His phone buzzed with a message from Lynn, Harbinger waiting. Decision. Daniel typed his response. Execute joint venture plan B. Cancel Harbinger acquisition. The future stretched before him, suddenly unscripted. Without revenge as his North Star, Daniel would need to find a new purpose, a new direction for the empire he'd built. As he started the car, his gaze drifted back to the house, where Catherine stood watching from the window. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. A moment of connection, of possibility. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't reconciliation or happy endings. But it was a beginning, or perhaps more accurately, a chance to begin again. And for now that was enough. Chapter 8. 3 months after the confrontation at the Blackwood estate, Manhattan sparkled under a fresh blanket of December snow. The Reed Global Ventures headquarters, no longer hidden behind the modest facade of Reed Solutions, occupied the top 10 floors of a midtown skyscraper, its lobby adorned with a towering Christmas tree and subtle holiday decorations. Daniel stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the swirling snowflakes. The view was a far cry from the cramped Brooklyn space where he'd plotted his revenge, but the man himself had changed even more dramatically than his surroundings. The Blackwood restructuring is proceeding on schedule, Lynn reported, scrolling through updates on her tablet. The new board has approved the 5-year strategic plan, and initial market response has been positive. Their stock is up 12% since the announcement. Daniel nodded, still gazing at the city below. And Maxwell's transition? Smoother than expected, Lynn replied. He's actually been quite cooperative with the new leadership team. The public statement acknowledging his misjudgment regarding your supply chain innovations generated significant media coverage. All positive for both companies. And Richard? Lynn's expression soured slightly. Less cooperative. He's made some noise about challenging the board restructuring, but without his father's support it's going nowhere. Daniel turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. He needs a purpose. Find him something where he can't do much damage but might actually contribute. Maybe the European marketing division. Lynn raised an eyebrow. That's unexpectedly generous. It's practical, Daniel countered, though they both knew it was more than that. The white-hot need for revenge had cooled, leaving room for more nuanced responses, even toward Richard, who had perhaps been the cruelest of all the Blackwoods. And Catherine? Lynn asked carefully. Daniel's expression revealed nothing. What about her? She's requested a meeting. Again. Lynn studied her boss with the insight of someone who had worked closely with him through his darkest days. That's the 3rd request this month, Daniel. You can't avoid her forever. I'm not avoiding her, Daniel protested. I'm giving us both space to adjust to the new reality. Lynn's skeptical look made it clear she wasn't convinced. The gala is tomorrow night. Both companies will be represented. You'll have to face her then. The gala, a charity event benefiting education for underprivileged youth, would mark the first public appearance of both Daniel and the Blackwoods since the restructuring announcement. The business world was buzzing with speculation about how they would interact. I'll be professional, Daniel assured her. That's all anyone can expect. Lynn's expression softened slightly. Daniel, you've achieved everything you set out to do. You built an empire from nothing. You proved everyone who doubted you wrong. You even showed mercy when revenge was within your grasp. She paused. But you're still not happy. I'm fine, Daniel replied automatically. No, you're not, Lynn countered gently. You work 18-hour days. You've turned down every social invitation that isn't strictly business-related. You live in this office more than your own home. She met his gaze directly. You're hiding from something, or someone. Daniel turned back to the window, unwilling to admit how accurately Lynn had diagnosed his state of mind. The truth was he didn't know how to move forward. For 3 years his life had been defined by a single purpose: revenge against the Blackwoods. Now that he'd abandoned that mission he felt oddly adrift. And then there was Catherine, a complication he hadn't fully anticipated. Their brief encounters during the restructuring negotiations had been strictly professional, but he'd felt her gaze following him, filled with questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. I need time, he said finally. Take all the time you need, Lynn replied, heading for the door. Just don't take so much that you miss what might be waiting for you. After she left, Daniel remained at the window watching darkness fall over the city. Tomorrow's gala loomed in his mind, not just as a business obligation, but as an emotional hurdle he wasn't certain he was prepared to clear. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glittered with the combined wealth of New York's business elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with winter lilies and silver candelabras. A string quartet played unobtrusively in the corner as attendees in formal wear mingled, the subtle competition of wealth and status playing out in designer gowns and rare vintage watches. Daniel moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting congratulations on Reed Global's recent successes and fielding questions about the surprising joint venture with Blackwood Industries. His tuxedo, custom-made by the same tailor who dressed royalty, was a far cry from the off-the-rack suit he'd worn to the charity gala where he'd first revealed hints of his new status to the Blackwoods. The man of the hour, James Chin greeted him, champagne flute in hand. "How does it feel to be the talk of Wall Street?" "Overrated," Daniel replied with a wry smile. "How's Sarah?" "Due any day now," James beamed, clearly delighted at the impending arrival of his first child. "She wanted to be here tonight, but doctor's orders kept her home." "Give her my best," Daniel said. "And let me know when the baby arrives. I've already ordered an inappropriately extravagant gift." James laughed, then his expression grew more serious. "I saw Maxwell earlier. He asked if you were here yet." "Checking if I fulfilled my obligation under the agreement," Daniel guessed. "Actually, I think he wants to talk to you." James nodded toward the far side of the ballroom. "The Blackwoods are at table 7. Maxwell has been surprisingly conciliatory in recent interviews." Daniel followed his friend's gaze. Maxwell and Richard sat at a round table, deep in conversation with several board members. Catherine was notably absent. "I'll speak with him later," Daniel said, scanning the room for any sign of her. "Looking for someone else?" James asked knowingly. Before Daniel could respond, the ballroom doors opened to admit a latecomer. Catherine stood framed in the doorway for a moment, a vision in midnight blue. Her gown, elegant in its simplicity, complemented her fair coloring perfectly. Her hair was swept up, revealing the graceful line of her neck and the sapphire earrings that had been her grandmother's. Daniel felt his breath catch, an involuntary reaction he immediately tried to suppress. It was impossible to deny her beauty, but it was more than that. It was the memories her presence evoked, of happier times before ambition and family loyalty had torn them apart. "You should talk to her," James urged quietly. "About what?" Daniel asked, still watching Catherine as she made her way into the room, graciously acknowledging acquaintances but moving with clear purpose. "About whatever is keeping that look on your face whenever her name comes up," James replied. "You've conquered the business world, Daniel. Maybe it's time to figure out what else matters." Before Daniel could formulate a response, Catherine spotted him across the crowded room. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade into the background. The music, the chatter, the glittering surroundings. She began moving toward him with determined strides. Daniel steeled himself for the encounter, aware of the curious glances from those who recognized the former couple and understood the complicated history between them. "Daniel," Catherine greeted him, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. "Catherine," he replied. "You look well." "Thank you." Her gaze shifted briefly to James, who took the hint with surprising alacrity. "I just spotted the Thompson sisters," he announced. "I should say hello." "Excuse me." As James disappeared into the crowd, Catherine turned back to Daniel. "You've been avoiding me." "I've been busy," Daniel countered. "The joint venture requires significant attention." 3 canceled meetings and 2 unreturned phone calls go beyond busy, Catherine observed. "Are you afraid to talk to me?" The directness of the question, so typical of Catherine, caught Daniel off guard. "Afraid isn't the word I'd use." "What word would you use then?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Cautious," he decided. "Our history is complicated." Catherine's laugh held little humor. That might be the understatement of the year. She glanced around at the crowded ballroom. "Can we talk somewhere more private? Please." The request, or perhaps the please that followed it, made refusal difficult. Daniel nodded toward a set of French doors leading to a small terrace. 5 minutes. The terrace was empty, the December cold keeping most guests inside. Catherine pulled her wrap tighter around her shoulders as they stepped into the crisp night air. "I've been thinking about you," she began without preamble. About us. About everything that happened, not just the end but the beginning too. Daniel remained silent, wary of where this conversation might lead. We never really talked about it, Catherine continued. About why I didn't stand up for you when my father had you removed from the building. Why I chose my family over you. It was pretty clear at the time, Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. Your family's approval meant more than our marriage. Catherine shook her head. It wasn't that simple, and I think you know it. My father controlled everything. My trust fund, my position in the company, my entire future. I was too weak, too afraid to go against him. And now? Daniel asked. Now I understand what real strength looks like, she replied, meeting his gaze directly. I watched you build something extraordinary from nothing. I saw you show mercy when you could have destroyed us completely. That took courage I'm not sure I would have had in your position. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and Daniel felt something shift inside him. A loosening of the tight knot of resentment he'd carried for so long. Why are we having this conversation, Catherine? What do you want from me? She took a step closer to him, close enough that he could detect the subtle scent of her perfume, still the same one she'd worn when they were married. A second chance, she said simply. Not to pick up where we left off. Too much has happened for that. But a chance to start again with our eyes open this time. No illusions, no idealizations. Daniel studied her face, looking for any sign of manipulation or ulterior motive. He found none, only vulnerability and a cautious hope that mirrored his own unacknowledged feelings. A lot has changed, he said carefully. I'm not the same person you married. I know, Catherine replied. That's part of why I'm asking. The man you've become, the one who built Reed Global, who created Phantom, who chose negotiation over destruction, I'd like to get to know him. Before Daniel could respond, the terrace doors opened and Maxwell Blackwood stepped out. He hesitated when he saw his daughter in close conversation with Daniel, clearly considering a strategic retreat. Dad, Catherine acknowledged him, stepping back slightly from Daniel. We were just talking. I can see that, Maxwell replied, his gaze moving between them with a mixture of resignation and concern. I apologize for the interruption. I was hoping to speak with Daniel about the joint venture announcement next week, but it can wait. It's fine, Daniel said, secretly relieved by the interruption. Catherine's request for a second chance had stirred emotions he wasn't fully prepared to examine. What's on your mind, Maxwell? The older man glanced at his daughter. Perhaps we should discuss it privately. Whatever you have to say to Daniel, you can say in front of me, Catherine insisted. No more secrets, no more manipulation. Maxwell sighed, looking suddenly every one of his 67 years. Very well. I wanted to thank you, Daniel, for your generosity in the restructuring agreement. You could have destroyed us completely. That you chose not to speaks to a character I failed to recognize 3 years ago. The acknowledgement, clearly difficult for a proud man like Maxwell to make, took Daniel by surprise. It was a business decision, he said, unwilling to admit the personal factors that had influenced his choice. We both know it was more than that, Maxwell countered. Just as we both know my rejection of you was never truly about your business ideas. It was about my own prejudice. My belief that someone from your background could never be worthy of my daughter or my company. The blunt admission hung in the air between them. I was wrong, Maxwell continued. About your potential, about your character, about many things. The joint venture has already demonstrated that your vision for the company was sound all along. I should have seen that. Daniel struggled to process this unexpected apology from a man who had once been the architect of his greatest humiliation. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm an old man who's been forced to confront his mistakes, Maxwell replied candidly. And because my daughter hasn't smiled, truly smiled, since the day you left. Whatever is happening between you two. He gestured vaguely at the space between them. I won't stand in its way this time. With that remarkable statement, Maxwell nodded to them both and returned to the ballroom, leaving Daniel and Catherine in stunned silence. That, Daniel finally said, was unexpected. He's changed, Catherine agreed. We all have. She moved closer again, her eyes searching his face. The question is, have we changed enough to try again? Or is there too much history between us now? Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman who had once broken his heart but someone who had grown and evolved just as he had. The potential for hurt remained, that was undeniable. But there was also the possibility of something he had not allowed himself to consider for years. Happiness. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But perhaps we could start by having dinner sometime. As two people getting to know each other again." Catherine's smile, genuine and warm, was answer enough. "I'd like that," she said simply. Above them, snowflakes began to fall softly, dusting their shoulders and catching in Catherine's hair like tiny stars. It wasn't a fairy tale reunion or a dramatic declaration of undying love. It was something quieter, more tentative, but perhaps more real for its caution. A careful step toward possibility. Daniel reached out, brushing a snowflake from Catherine's cheek, allowing himself to feel the warmth of her skin beneath his fingers. It was a small gesture, but it bridged a distance much greater than the physical space between them. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra had begun to play a familiar melody, the first dance from their wedding reception years ago. Whether coincidence or fate, it seemed to mark a moment of transition, a turning point. "Shall we go back inside?" Daniel asked, offering his arm with formal courtesy. Catherine took it, her hand light on his sleeve. "Yes," she said. "I think it's time." Together they stepped back into the warmth and light of the ballroom, not as adversaries or even ex-spouses, but as two people carrying the weight of their shared history while cautiously exploring the potential of their future. Across the room, Maxwell watched them enter together, a complex mixture of emotions playing across his face. Beside him, Richard followed his gaze and frowned. "You're not seriously approving of this," he muttered to his father. "It's not my approval to give any more," Maxwell replied quietly. "Your sister and Daniel will make their own choices now." "After what he did to our company?" Richard demanded. Maxwell turned to his son with unexpected sharpness. "After what we did to him," he corrected. "It's time we acknowledged our part in creating this situation, Richard. Daniel Reed didn't appear out of nowhere to destroy us. We created our own nemesis through our arrogance and cruelty." Richard stared at his father in disbelief, but Maxwell's attention had already returned to the couple making their way through the crowd. Whatever happened between them now, he understood at last that some bonds couldn't be broken by pride or power or even betrayal. Some connections ran deeper, waiting patiently beneath the surface for the right moment to re-emerge. Whether Daniel and Catherine would find their way back to each other remained to be seen. But tonight, in this moment, they had taken the first step on a new path, one that offered the possibility of healing rather than destruction, of building rather than tearing down. And in the end, perhaps that was the true measure of success. Not the empire Daniel had built or the revenge he had abandoned, but the capacity to move beyond the pain of the past toward something new and as yet undefined. The future, for once, was unwritten. The private dining room at Daniel's penthouse offered a panoramic view of Manhattan lit up against the night sky. A small group gathered around the elegantly set table, James and Sarah Chin with their 6-month-old daughter, Lin Wei and her husband, and Catherine seated beside Daniel at the head of the table. To the official launch of the Blackwood Reed Foundation, James proposed, raising his glass in a toast. "May it change as many lives as its founders have changed each other's." The others echoed the sentiment, clinking glasses as Daniel and Catherine exchanged a private smile. The foundation, dedicated to providing entrepreneurial opportunities to underprivileged youth, represented the culmination of a year's careful work rebuilding trust, not just between them personally but between their business interests as well. "I still can't believe my father agreed to serve on the board," Catherine remarked. "A year ago that would have been unthinkable." "People change," Daniel replied. "Some more dramatically than others." The evening proceeded with the comfortable warmth of close friends enjoying each other's company. As dinner concluded, Daniel excused himself briefly, returning with a small velvet box that he placed beside Catherine's dessert plate. "What's this?" she asked, looking up at him with curious eyes. "Open it," he suggested quietly. Inside was a key, simple, unadorned but clearly significant from the way Daniel watched her reaction. "A key," Catherine prompted, understanding there was more to the gesture. "To a house in Santorini," Daniel explained. "On the cliff overlooking the sea, near where we spent our honeymoon." The table fell silent, all eyes on the couple as the significance of the gesture became clear. "It's not a proposal," Daniel clarified, his voice gentle but assured. Not yet. We've agreed to take things slowly, to rebuild what was broken between us with patience and care. Catherine's fingers closed around the key, her eyes bright with emotion. But it's a promise, she completed his thought. A commitment to our future, whatever shape it takes. Daniel nodded, reaching for her hand across the table. The last year has taught me that some things are worth more than revenge, more than pride, more than being right. Some connections deserve a second chance. James raised his glass again. To second chances, he offered. And to the wisdom to recognize them when they come, Lynn added, her usual practicality softened by genuine happiness for her friend and mentor. As conversation resumed around them, Catherine leaned closer to Daniel. I never thought we'd find our way back here, she admitted softly. After everything that happened. Neither did I, Daniel confessed. For years I defined myself by the moment your family rejected me. I built an empire to prove them wrong, to exact revenge for that humiliation. And now. He smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way it rarely had during those years of plotting and calculation. Now I'm building something different. Something better. We're building it together, Catherine corrected him, her fingers intertwining with his. Later, after their guest had departed, they stood on the penthouse terrace overlooking the city that had witnessed both their downfall and their redemption. The Blackwood Building and the Reed Global Tower stood side by side on the skyline, symbols of their parallel journeys. Do you ever regret it? Catherine asked suddenly. Not going through with your original plan? Not destroying my family completely when you had the chance? Daniel considered the question thoughtfully. No, he said finally. Revenge would have been momentarily satisfying but ultimately empty. This, he gestured between them, is infinitely more valuable. Catherine studied his face in the moonlight, seeing not the wounded man who had returned seeking vengeance, nor the powerless husband her family had discarded, but someone new, someone who had emerged from pain and hardship with his essential goodness intact despite everything. The invisible billionaire, she murmured, using the nickname the financial press had given him during the years he had hidden his true wealth and power. Except you were never truly invisible. I always saw you, even when I was too afraid to stand by what I saw. Daniel pulled her gently into his arms, the last of his carefully constructed walls finally surrendering to the truth they had both been circling for months. That despite everything, the betrayal, the revenge, the pain they had caused each other, what remained between them was real and worth fighting for. Not invisible anymore, he said softly. Just seen differently. By others and by myself. Below them, the city continued its endless rhythm, a testament to ambition and reinvention, to falling and rising again. Daniel and Catherine stood together at its pinnacle, not as conqueror and conquered, not as predator and prey, but as equals who had traveled a long and difficult road to find their way back to each other. The past could not be erased. The scars of old wounds would always remain. But as they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, they understood at last that some journeys come full circle not because fate demands it, but because hearts, when true, find their way home against all odds. The man who had once been humiliated and discarded had indeed returned with unimaginable wealth and power. But in the end, his greatest triumph lay not in the empire he had built or the respect he had commanded, but in the capacity to choose love over revenge, forgiveness over retribution, creation over destruction. And in that choice, made not from weakness but from profound strength, Daniel Reed had truly become the billionaire he had always been meant to be. Not invisible but illuminated from within by something far more valuable than all his material success. A heart that, despite everything, remained capable of love. The end.